Virginians have always stood at the crossroads of the fight for freedom. It is a battle in which we all reap the benefits. Following the Second World War, two nations, the United States of America and the Soviet Union, emerged as superpowers and would dominate world affairs for the next 40 years. These countries possessed multiple nuclear weapons, which, if used, would assure not only their mutual destruction, but world ruination as well. Because these nations had deep-seated political, economic, and social differences, there existed a constant state of tension, leading to ongoing conflicts and threats around the world.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States.
Among those confrontations were the Berlin Blockade in 1948 and the use of submarines as pawns in the increasingly dangerous game called the Cold War. The growing friction between the Soviet Union and the United States and their allies boiled over in Germany in the spring of 1948. The Russians blockaded all ground transportation routes leading into the city of Berlin, leaving it isolated and surrounded by Soviet control.
What the world needs in order to regain a sense of security is an end to Soviet obstruction and aggression.
The only remaining connection to Berlin was by air, and the Soviets believed the Allies would not supply Berlin by planes alone. This was the first major conflict of the Cold War.
One day we came back from a flight. The operations officer met us and he said, "Boys, pack your bags." He said, "You're not going to sleep." He said, "You're going to get back on that airplane with a couple other crews and you're going to Germany." And we said, "To Germany?" Yeah, he said, "The Russians have blockaded Berlin and they need some help over there." So our whole squadron just packed up and went to Germany.
After World War II, Germany was divided into sectors. There were 4 sectors. And Berlin was also divided into sectors. Russians, the Americans, and British and French, and governed by a group of all parties.
The Russians had closed off the access to Berlin. They closed the roads, the canals, and the railroads. And the only access that we had to Berlin was by air. We had 3 air corridors, and we could fly airplanes in and out. And there was an agreement with the Russians that those corridors would stay open. So they didn't stop our airplanes; they stopped everything else.
They closed the checkpoints there for the vehicles to go into Berlin. So that was the triggering point. So they said they put their Russian soldiers up at their guns and tanks and says, "You aren't going to haul any food into Berlin. You aren't going to take anything to Berlin." This is well, of course, the Westerners think, well, all the Germans will starve. That makes no difference to us. Let them starve, that was the Russian attitude. The people of Berlin were faced with, just be left to starve and freeze to death.
Berlin was the 7th largest city in the world before World War II. So there's you're talking about a lot of people that all of a sudden were deprived of food, coal, and the wherewithal to survive. Soviets felt like if they blockaded the city, they could force our administrators, our military people, out of Berlin. And we'd give up Berlin, they'd take Berlin, and eventually they'd take over the entire central part of Europe.
General May, I guess, was humanitarian enough to say that's not going to be the case. We had that air corridor. That was part of the treaty from World War II with the air corridors into and out of Berlin. So we said, well, we'll fly some stuff in. So we started flying food, and it ended up, strangely enough, the coal was the main thing that we hauled into Berlin.
The first few trips were pretty hectic because the air traffic control was kind of sporadic. And you'd have airplanes going at different speeds, you know, all depending on what the pilot wanted to do. And then you'd have a bunch of them converging in Berlin.
In the beginning, hauled everything. Just anything they could pick up, they put in the airplanes and they flew them over.
I think originally they started out with intervals of about 7 or 8 minutes.
We were ill-equipped right there in Germany to run anything on a large scale. But luckily we had some people with foresight and guts. Truman, and General Marshall, and General Vandenberg, and General May, and General Tunner. The leadership was there at the time.
Along came a friend of his, General Tunner. Came in and took over, and he ran the Berlin airlift. General Tunner organized this thing so that he, you know, visualized the altitude of the airplanes flying so that you could fly so close together with not ever knowing that the other guy's there. They gathered in over 300 of these C-54s, which they had none in the beginning. And so that made the big difference. That was the key to it, was now that we had the same kind of airplane, which meant it would fly at the same speeds and at the same all effects of nature that affect the airplane would affect them all the same way.
But as the time went on and the radar control was better and they got better equipment, more experience on the part of the controllers, they shortened it down. And at the time I left there, it was down to 1 minute apart. Fantastic. Fly airplanes loaded with coal to Berlin. But it was about 10 tons, full load for the C-54.
The coal was put in sacks. And they load the sacks into a truck, a big old army truck. You pull up to your designated place, and there's this crew with a truck. And as soon as you stop, the cargo door opened, they back up to it, and they come in and unload the thing. And it's done in about like 7 or 8 minutes. Amazing. And then you go ahead and close the cargo door, start your engines, and away you go. And you just over and over and over is the way this process worked, around the clock.
We looked like coal miners. Every time I flew the airplane and came back, the coal dust that flew around, you came, all you have a couple little white eyeballs is about all you have, and the rest of you were covered. Your uniform and your hair, everything else was covered with coal dust.
They could unload an airplane in less than 15 minutes. We would just have time to go to the little flight line snack wagon and grab a cup of cocoa or a cup of coffee, a donut, climb back on board, and you're ready to go.
It got to be so routine that it was that the next step towards the end was to keep the pilots from becoming too familiar. When in fact it was just as bad the last flight in as it was the first flight.
Because several times we were buzzed while we were en route to Berlin. On clear nights, we were buzzed by Russian airplanes with no lights on. They like to dive down right in front of us.
That we thank the Russians for causing the Berlin airlift, because we got the same training, got the same thing, and we changed to be an all-weather airport. The Russians did not, and that's why we defeated them in Korea so handily, because our pilots were that much better.
General Tunner said that's what he wanted, no cowboy stuff. He wanted no heroics, just wanted things to be safe and routine. I think we lost 31 Americans that were killed in crashes, but that wasn't too bad for what we did.
The Soviets looked at what was going on. We're now building up backlogs, of supplies. And they looked at what was going on, how this airlift worked, and they said they figured they weren't getting anything out of it but a bad press, so they called it off.
It was the first battle of the Cold War. That was the first time we really stood up to them.
Here we were 3 years beforehand, we were bombing them, and all of a sudden now the same guys are back there furnishing them coal for their factories and coal to heat them and so forth, and food to keep them going. So their reaction was dramatic. They said, well, if this is the way it's going to be, and we're not going to be abandoned to the Soviets, they responded very positively and built their country back up. They are so indebted and so grateful, the Berlin people, and the German people for what happened during that period, that they know that the last 50 years of their existence, of their reasonably a good existence was due to the Berlin airlift.
It was the first major confrontation in the Cold War and the first major victory.
The United States Navy submarine force became an irreplaceable tool in the ongoing surveillance of the Soviet Union, bringing new meaning to the name Silent Service. This ongoing reconnaissance was a tedious and unpredictable strategy for both the Soviet and U.S. navies, and one that yielded a wealth of information from the frigid waters of the Cold War.
Throughout the period of the Cold War, we were in a situation where either of the two countries that were standing off against one another, the United States and all of our allies, and the Soviet Union and all of the countries that represented the Soviet Union, really had the capability to destroy the other country.
As time passed and the nuclear submarine came in about 10 years after the World War II was over, it became a state-of-the-art kind of thing. That's what our nuclear submarines did during the entire Cold War, was watch the Soviets, trail them when they picked them up in the middle of the ocean, kept the threat on the Soviet Union the entire time, and in many respects was a crucial element in the ultimate failure of the Soviet Union.
Submarines provide a tremendous amount of capability for being able to detect things that are happening when other people don't know that you're there. And there's a valuable component to submarines from the perspective of being able to go to places that other people don't think you can get to, and be able to operate in those particular waters and gather intelligence and gather information about how other countries are actually operating. For periods up to 60 days, we're in trail of a Soviet ballistic missile submarine. Sometimes the distances between those ships as they were accomplishing these trail operations would be measured in the hundreds of yards. Their submarines were good, but our submarines were better.
On a submarine, you know everybody. Everybody. And the officers are much different too. I never saw a submarine officer that I wasn't happy with. I've never seen a submariner with a Purple Heart. You come back or you don't come back.
I was assigned to USS Halibut, SSGN 587, which ended up getting 2 presidential unit citations, and it was a submarine that went into the Sea of Oshkosh behind the Kamchatka Peninsula and tapped the cable. So they picked up the Russian transmissions, uncoded, straight language, what we call pure English transmission.
One of your missions was you had a 2-month period where you went on what they call Spec Ops, which was an intelligence gathering mission. So that was a routine part of the way the submarines were employed. And for those 2 months, you were basically under radio silence. We were collecting electronic intelligence. So we had antennas up all the time. We'd operate at periscope depth. And we'd take pictures when we had a chance.
At that time, there was a big debate going on between the U.S. and Russia that the U.S. recognized 3 miles as the international limit, the international waters, and Russia recognized 12. We observed the U.S. And sometimes, not even that, we got caught by the Russians. Our little periscope was up there, shooting a rooster tail 20 feet high. I don't know. So, and they picked us up, and what they tried to do, what they tried to do is force you to surface, because at that time there were a lot of fleet boats that were up there. They're fast attacks and others, but they would try to force you to the surface. They had us, and we were running, and I think it was for about 4 days. And that was tense. One of those beautiful low-pressure cells moved across the North Pacific and just made it too rough, and we got away by that.
I was never detected. The boats I was on were never detected, at least that we knew about. But there were some boats that were depth charged. This was in peacetime.
We were at sea when Kennedy was assassinated. It sort of tightened tension because here we are and our job is to shoot. We got 5 of these suckers on board, and we're supposed to shoot all 5. We're supposed to stay on the surface long enough to guide them to their targets, you know, and just, yeah, think about it now, looking back, there's no way on God's green earth we could have got 5 of them off before they found all that telemetry going up to guide those things.
We carried teams of intelligence specialists with us. Because we used to occasionally, we'd put agents ashore, either civilian agents or military special operations people. We'd come up not completely surfaced, but where the deck was just awash, and they'd go out with their rubber boat and they'd go off in the night. That was a lot of fun. It was, you know, it's like being in the movies or something.
I also made other patrols that I don't know where I was. I guess we were spying. That's all I can say. Because we were outside of some, at night, we surfaced. We were outside of some ports, but I don't know what port they were because I had no knowledge, no need to know. And that's what we call SS, after your name, silent service. And unless you have the need to know, you don't know where you've been.
It's important that even though people would like to know all the details of what the submarine force did during the Cold War, the reality is we need to make sure that our ships that are operating today in the waters around the world where they can perform the missions that are important to our country are capable of continuing to utilize the skills and the techniques and the procedures that were developed during the Cold War so that we don't put at risk those individuals that are operating our submarines around the world today. It's a remarkable example of diplomacy at work and how over a period of 45 to 50 years there was this standoff that existed, and when we conducted operations we were part of that game of chess.